Charles Robert Darwin, explorer, naturalist, scientist. There are perhaps no other names that are remembered as having such a profound impact on how we understand the world. His discoveries became the basis for modern biology and all the advancements to civilization it has brought us. Darwin Day is celebrated every year on Darwin's birthday. It is a relatively recent tradition, officially starting in 1995. It is marked as a day for scientists, science enthusiasts, and teachers to gather and discuss Darwin, science, and humanity, a celebration of civilization. February 12, 2009 will be the 200th birthday of Charles Darwin, which, due to our natural fondness for round numbers, makes this year particularly memorable. The following videos are of the Darwin Day celebration in Carmichael, California. It was formatted as a birthday party for Charles Darwin. The welcoming was given by Minga Futrell, the co-chair of the organizing committee. The master of ceremonies was Liam McDade, the astronomy coordinator of Sacramento City College. The first presentation was an act by science comedian Brian Marlowe. The feature was a speech by author, historian, and founder of the Skeptic Society, Michael Shermer. Mr. Shermer discusses history, biology, Darwin, and the importance of Darwin's work. He also read excerpts from his own book and discussed the intelligent design and creationism movement. It was a very entertaining and enlightening event, and I am pleased to share it with you.
I think I'm going to be doing this a lot here. Going to go back to the day when I was giving a real... Assuming I don't turn it on. Okay. I want to give another big hand for Theory of Evolution. Since that song was just the here and now today. Okay, we actually have today, we're very honored actually, being that this is the 200th anniversary of Darwin Day. It's kind of a big deal. And it's also the 150th anniversary of the first publication of Origin of Species, because Darwin conveniently waited until he was 50 to do it. So that makes all the numbers work out. It's very nice. Brian Mallow is a science comedian who has been interested in science ever since he was 10. He has been performing as a comedian in one form or another for decades. He asked me to mention that he has CDs for sale, so I'm doing that. I think it's pretty clear, obviously, the CDs are over back in the corner, as you can see. I want to mention some of the things he's done. He's performed on CBS, A&E, Tech TV, and the Discovery Channel. He has performed for Microsoft, Apple, Dell, the American Chemical Society, the National Institute of Standards, and what's the T stand for, Brian?
Technology.
Technology, thank you. And the National Academy of Sciences. Truly an impressive array. We're extremely lucky to have him here today, so let's give a hand to science comedian Brian Mallow.
Thank you, Liam. I can't believe I have to follow the theory of evolution. That's a tough act to follow. I'm the kind of comedian, even though I've been a stand-up comic for a long time, and I've opened for some somewhat famous people like Dennis Miller and Craig Ferguson and Kenny Loggins, but I'm the kind of comic that's a little more excited about opening for Michael Shermer. And I'm not saying that just to suck up to you. But it seemed to have worked that way. So I haven't always been a comic. I used to be an astronomer, but I got stuck on the day shift, which sucks. You don't discover anything good. A cloud, great. And I'm sorry, I know that joke could be offensive to solar or radio astronomers. I'm aware of that. They work on the day shift by choice. Isaac Asimov once said, "The most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not eureka, but that's funny." Have we got any Isaac Asimov fans here? Yeah. I would say that Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke were bigger influences on me than George Carlin or Richard Pryor in terms of shaping my sensibilities. I grew up liking their science fiction. I found they wrote a lot of science fact, and that their nonfiction was at least as much fun. and exciting, and I think that was probably my early introduction into science. And if you're like me, and I think if you're in this room, you are to some degree, and I apologize for that. I don't think it's my fault. But if you like science, it's hard to understand why more people don't. Because it's so fundamental, it's so basic, it's so fundamental to who we are as humans. It's just, how can you peer out of those tiny holes in your skull with anything but curiosity? And that's all science is, right? Satisfying our curiosity, asking those basic questions. You know, who are we? Where are we going? How much will it cost? Will I be expected to tip? And I've always been a curious kid. At least that's what the neighbors said. I think they meant well. I remember when I was about 10 years old, I asked my dad, why is the sky blue? It's a pretty natural question for a little 10-year-old scientist. My dad said, go ask your mother. So I thought, great, she knows. So I went off in search of my mom, and I really felt like I was experiencing the scientific method, like I was following in the footsteps of Galileo and Newton. And I found my mom, and I asked her, Mom, why is the sky blue? And I'll never forget her answer, because I said so. At first, I was in awe of my mom. Later, I learned not to trust her in matters of science. Now here, this is really nice. We're in a room full of people that we have a worldview that we don't accept because I said so as an answer to our questions. And obviously there are other worldviews that will accept that. And you know, what's wrong with questions? That's the thing, is like, we're okay with questions. We're okay with not knowing some things. In fact, questions are wonderful things. Questions open up whole new fields of discovery. So we're okay with questions. And maybe there are some things that we're never gonna even get answers to. You know, like, you know, the very most basic cosmological question, why is there something instead of nothing? Yeah. I have a theory, it was a tax write-off. It was more beneficial to have a universe than not have a universe. And it was designed to fail, and we'll see what happens there. So I don't know, but I'm okay with questions. Like, I can't, you know, just because we don't know where all this came from, I've never been able to believe in a supreme being. You know? Yeah, maybe what is it, maybe a deluxe being. Yes, I can see that. Maybe a being with extra cheese. But that's, I think, about as far as I can push it right there. So I am a little, I gotta say, I'm a little conscious of my posture. Always have been, as long as I've been getting on stage. I think it's because when I was a kid, my mother used to tell me to stand up straight. Did you ever get that from your mom? It's very standard, pretty universal. Almost as if mothers have been programmed to tell their children to stand up straight. I think mothers have been telling their kids that for longer than we realize. Perhaps even to pre-human days. What if that were the driving force behind the evolutionary trend to walk erect? Can you see that? Mothers nagging their children up the evolutionary ladder. Stand up straight. Don't drag your knuckles when you walk. What, are you born in a tree? Do you want the other families to think we're not evolving? How many times do I have to tell you? That would be the origin of mathematics. You're like, They say apes are our closest cousins, but we never have them over. That's not cool. You know, it is, so this year is a big year for science. It is 150 years since The Origin of Species was published. And it is, Darwin would have been 200, Darwin and Lincoln, both born February 12th, 1809, both would have been, in a couple days, 200 years old. Yeah, it's sad when they're taken from us so young. But The Origin of Species, I'm almost, as much as I love to read science books, I mean, do you like to read science books for fun? I wish I could read books as fast as I buy them. I hoard books. I hoard books like on some level I know there's a coming apocalypse and my library will be essential to kickstart civilization. You ever wish for that thing? At the point of purchase, don't you just wish the information could be uploaded right to your brain? Yeah. Which is all we're doing when we're reading, right? We transfer the information from one storage device, the book, into this storage device, the original iPod. And you just wish that it could be a little, I just want to pick up the bit rate, you know? Transfer it a little faster. But I am almost embarrassed to say, and that I just finally started to read The Origin of Species. So has anyone here read it? Of course. Now don't tell me how it ends. Let me have a little suspense. Actually, it doesn't end. Isn't that the key to it? It doesn't end. We're not the point of evolution. We're not the end product, the final destination. We're just one of the latest chapters in an ongoing story. So, I just read something interesting. It was a news story. This sort of thing happens pretty much every year, and it always fascinates me. This one was about a kid in a state park in Colorado who got killed by a mountain lion. His parents let him run ahead. They came around a corner, and they saw their child being mauled to death by a mountain lion. And that is pretty outside our experience, for the most part. To be killed by a predator doesn't happen very often. Unless you get drunk and climb a fence at the zoo, you're usually okay. But I could imagine a slightly altered reality where occasionally you're walking downtown, maybe headed back to the office after lunch. You round the corner of a building and, oh my God, a cheetah! You know, I'm screwed. You know, I don't even have my running shoes. Run for your life. Trip up your buddy, run for your life. Sorry, Albert, he's only hungry enough to eat you. And I think the reason I'm so fascinated by the story is that I have really bad vision. I have to wear glasses or contacts, or both. These are the contacts. My eyes are bad. You should see the glasses. And one day I realized if I had been born a couple thousand years ago, I would have been weeded out really early. Because I wouldn't even recognize a predator until it was dangerously close. You know, I'd be going, what is that? Is that a saber-toothed tiger? Yeah, I think that's why short guys with bad vision often develop a sense of humor. It's a survival mechanism. If I can keep a couple people entertained, maybe they'll let me know I'm about to walk off a cliff. You know, this way, funny guy, that's how we lost the last one. And I know we didn't coexist with saber-toothed tigers, by the way. Did anyone want to call me on that one? That's being a science comedian. I have to worry about some of the things that most comedians do not have to worry about. I not only have to be funny, but I have to be scientifically and mathematically accurate. Sometimes I have to be literal. I was telling a story about the heat in Arizona once, and I mentioned it was 125 degrees, and I said, that just sounds like science fiction. That just sounds like you're talking about the surface of Venus, right? And in the back of the room, someone said, no. Venus is much hotter than that. So, you know, I had to say, I know that. I was using a comedic device called exaggeration. I should be allowed that. I had an interesting experience once, too. I was driving across Texas, and I stopped at a rest area. And, yeah, there are many experiences I could have had, This one was far away from any school boards. I was on the road, I stopped at a rest area, and when I came back to my car, there was a bird eating bugs off the grill of my car. And it was very interesting. It was obvious he had scoped it out. It was really interesting. Like, this bird had found his niche. He's figured out that he doesn't need to waste his time and energy hunting down bugs when a fresh shipment is coming in every few minutes. A nice selection, still warm on the grill. It's a little bird buffet. All you can eat. We deliver. He probably thought he had a symbiotic relationship with my car. I get fed, you get groomed, everyone's a winner. What, have there been too many jokes about symbiosis already? I hate when that happens. So, one thing that I hope is going to happen as we move forward with a new administration, a new president, that seems to care about a lot of things, actually. Other humans that aren't in his same class. And he seems to care about science, and hopefully he'll listen to science advisors. I'm a little concerned that we're trashing the planet, and we don't have space travel. Does that seem backwards to anyone? Like, first perfect interstellar flight, then soil the home planet? Wouldn't that make better sense? And I don't mean to preach, brothers and sisters, but we have treated the Earth like the Who treated a hotel room. And we haven't even stopped with the Earth. If you think about it, what little bit we've gotten out into space, everywhere we've gone, we've left stuff everywhere, like a high-tech trail of breadcrumbs. We've got a bunch of stuff on the moon. We've got stuff roaming around Mars. We've dropped stuff on Venus, on moons of Saturn. There are a couple things that we just flung out into the galaxy with no destination in mind. I just know somewhere out there there's an extraterrestrial looking on with that one tear. You know the spacecraft I'm talking about, the Voyager and Pioneer craft? Remember they carried these plaques that were messages in case these spacecraft are ever found. My favorite, it's the Pioneer 10 image, and it's a very famous image. It's a naked man and woman, and they're not holding hands. You know, they wanted them, they were going to have them hold hands, but this is true. They realized that from an alien perspective, if they had them holding hands, it might look like one creature instead of two. So they actually had them like almost holding hands, kind of like, you know, co-workers at a work function that would, under the table, kind of like to hold hands, but better not because they don't want to get in trouble. So there was a naked man and woman, there was representation of the solar system, and then there was a line showing the path of the spacecraft leaving the third planet. I think everyone here knows that. And did anyone else ever look at that and think, wow, that just looks like a menu with directions to the restaurant? I mean, I don't know if anything is ever going to find it, like a message in a bottle in the vastness of space. But what if it is found? And what if they're not friendly? What if they're hungry? We look fleshy and delicious. We don't have an exoskeleton. We don't have claws. We look easier to eat than a pistachio or a crab. You know, they could have taken a little artistic license, made us look a little more fearsome, or even just a little more well-endowed so we could hold our heads up in galactic locker rooms. Would that have been asking too much? So if you're like me too, you must hate when there's bad science in a science fiction film. Does that drive you nuts? Yeah. You know, have you ever seen a movie for free and still felt like you got ripped off? It did cost you 2 hours of life, and you don't get that back. But I saw the movie Twister some time ago, and, you know, it had nice special effects. But the movie actually didn't even make sense. The whole movie was about this team of scientists. They're studying tornadoes, and they had a device they called Dorothy that they were trying to launch into a tornado. And Dorothy was composed of like 100 individual sensors. And, I might need a little more room than that, maybe not. So, Dorothy consists of like 100 individual sensors. The idea was if they could launch this into a tornado, they'll be able to map the dynamics of the tornado and better understand how they work. But in the whole movie, Dorothy was the only thing not sucked up into a tornado. Really, the only thing. Tornadoes were ripping up the Oklahoma landscape. An 18-wheeler took flight. A cow flies by twice. A little girl's dad is sucked out of a storm cellar, but these little balls spill out onto the highway. And there they remain. There's no breeze, not even a breeze. In one scene, they had a little product placement. They had the scientists cut out little Pepsi cans and attach them to each ball like wings. Because they were going, how can we make these things more aerodynamic? Well, as aerodynamic as what? A cow, for instance? I don't know if you can compete with that. The cow is designed for flight. Something about the hooves or the bell. In one scene, the scientists themselves were being sucked up. They were strapping themselves down because they're being sucked up into the sky. How frustrating to look down and see those little balls rocking back. The other classic one to me that's always stood out, and I know some of you will know exactly what I'm talking about as soon as I start, it's in Star Wars. It's in the original Star Wars 4. And it's in the classic scene where Obi-Wan and Luke need a ship to go on their little adventure. So they end up in this cantina, and they meet Han Solo. And Han Solo is bragging when he says, "You haven't heard of the Millennium Falcon? It's the ship that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. It sounds impressive, but as a lot of you know, a parsec, it's not a unit of time. It sounds like it has SEC in it, but it's actually a unit of distance. So that makes no sense. And a lot of people are going to go, get over it, it's just a movie. But you know what? No, he could have made up a word. It happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. He could have just made up a word, but he misused a word. And it jumps out at you when you know it. To me, that was no different than if you were supposed to meet someone somewhere and you showed up late and you go, I'm sorry, have you been waiting long? And you go, yeah, about 15 yards. I'm sitting here counting the inches. I don't know, maybe I'm just getting to be a crotchety old man. Do you ever feel like that? Like, yeah, exactly. And but I'm trying, you know, I'm trying to stay young. I hope I age gracefully. That's my only thing. It's like, I accept reality, and I just want to age gracefully. I already have gray hair. I don't care. Let it go all gray. Let it go blue. I don't care if it goes ultraviolet, in fact. In fact, if I lose my hair, that's what I'm going to say. I'm not bald. I have hair. It's just outside your visible spectrum. Don't touch. You gotta have faith. Well, you guys are wonderful. I'm so glad you're here. It's so good. It gives us faith to see this is going to turn out for this kind of an event. And I'm only a warm-up act for your featured speaker. I would like to tell you that I have a website, sciencecomedian.com. And yes, thank you. I made that up, and it was available. Is that a good sign for the world or a bad sign? That in even as late as 2007, sciencecomedian.com was available. Lucky for me. And I have a CD, Rational Comedy for an Irrational Planet, that has some of the stuff I just said and a bunch of stuff that I didn't say. And I guess I'd like to leave you with the words of another Isaac Newton, who once said, if I have seen further than others, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. Which is really an impressive thing and a like sobering thing to hear, because Isaac Newton, the inventor of gravity, universally hailed as one of the greatest scientific minds ever to walk the earth, believed in giants. So let that be a lesson to us all. No, actually, it does say something about science in general, and the way science is done, and how it's like a relay race, and how people carry the baton as far as they can, and they hand it off to the next generation. And so, you know, thank you for being here today. Thank you for helping us celebrate science, and happy birthday, Charles Darwin. You guys, thank you very much.
Is this a big enough smile? Are you happy, Fred? Okay. I think the next person needs own introduction, so Minga? No, I'm kidding. Minga, of course, is a volunteer organizer powerhouse here in the Sacramento area, has been behind things here locally for many years, and she, I think, along with all the other organizers, including Mr. Krispy Kreme, who has taken off his hat. You have to put your hat back on, because it's how people identify you. Come on, I know it's there. You were wearing it earlier. There we go, okay. Mr. Krispy Kreme and his wife over there in the corner. There you go. Shout out for some of the volunteers, and some others as well that I've missed. I apologize if I missed you. I've been keeping Darwin Day going for nigh on 12 years, and that's very good that I finally got to say nigh on. Minga wants to talk about the volunteers in general and the whole event with Darwin Day, and so rather than just prolong your introduction, why don't you welcome Minga Futrell.
I'm so pleased to see so many admirers of Darwin and champions of evolution and science here today. It's really exciting. This is Sacramento's 12th annual Darwin Day event. And gosh, there are a sure lot of my fellow primates here. This is the best. It's a big year. As you know, we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. And Charles Darwin is And he was and is a scientific giant. And many scientists think that his theory of evolution is just the most powerful scientific theory ever developed. So it's no wonder that we are just among over 500 Darwin celebrations that are happening around the U.S. and across the world, either on or around the February 12th date, which is coming up on Thursday. A great many of the community celebrations are taking place this weekend or next weekend. And there's another local event coming up I want to tell you about. There's a flyer for it over on this long table where you got your tickets. It's at the University of California, Davis, and it's on the 23rd, so that's pretty far out, but that's when they could arrange it. And next weekend is called Evolution Sunday, and people in hundreds of churches, as part of a project that's 3 years old now, to elevate the national dialogue on science and religion and evolution by celebrating Darwin's theory. That'll be taking place next weekend. And that annual event is fast becoming Evolution Weekend so that they can be more interfaith about it and have people in the synagogues and the temples and so forth to actually deal with the importance of Darwin's theory in modern science. And to recognize that religion and science need not be at loggerheads. Not all religion is fundamentalist. And all of these events, whether they're secular, they're academic, religious, honor in some way Charles Darwin's accomplishments and his contributions to human understanding. Each takes a different route. There are lectures, sermons, museum exhibitions, parties, film showings. It is doubtful, though, that any other will be quite like the one we have going on here in Carmichael. Where else is there a music group that's actually called Theory of Evolution and performing a song that was written for this day, for this event? And where else is there a science comedian? We got him. And 4 birthday cakes for Charlie. 4. One of them's even vegan. How about at a birthday party, one normally gives a gift to the honored person. But in fact, in this case, it's the honored person who has given us the gift.
Yes.
It's a gift of understanding life. So part of the purpose of this setting is to show our gratitude for Darwin's proposition and to reaffirm it as a momentous idea. Through these annual Darwin programs, we hope to raise awareness of the life and work of the 19th century scientist and to inform the community of his contributions to our understanding of the world and the life within it. We call Sacramento's celebration an educational gala. The main program and the displays are to educate about developments within evolutionary theory and scientific enterprise in the modern context. And most importantly, at this event, we promote and defend sound science education in curricula and in public school programs. And this last point is really what spurs much of my own efforts. The day's a social event, too. We've already had the great music and the comedy prelude to get you into a gala mood and to turn your brains on to science. The social time and the birthday cake afterward, after our featured presentation and a bit of Q&A, will give you time to meet with others who share this appreciation of the scientific endeavor and a commitment to sound science education. So please plan to stay and take that time and meet others. Just after the Q&A, before the refreshments, there will be a drawing for our gift basket, our door prize drawing, and also a drawing for any science educators in the audience. So if you are a science educator, make sure you make it over here and get your little, there's a ticket over there you can fill out, tell what school you're from, and drop it in that basket. You've got a really good chance because we don't have enough science educators here. Tell all the science teachers in this community to get here next year. Then we'll be singing, with the help of the band, we'll be singing the Happy Birthday Charlie song. That has been a feature of Sacramento's celebration from the beginning. And after that, when we break for the cake and camaraderie, you will have another chance to visit the literature tables and display tables, and be sure to check out those Darwin cartoons that are down along this wall if you haven't seen those yet. You must be present to win that prize, so that means staying past the Q&A. And our customary grand prize is a gift basket that includes a bunch of goodies and a book, and this time it is a signed book by Michael Sherman. So put your ticket in that drawing. I'm extending this welcome today on behalf of the organizing committee. We are all volunteers, and I need to acknowledge a number of people and groups who have made this day possible. There are many individuals who have given time and energy to the event, and in the interest of time, I am not calling out individual names, don't worry. But I do want to let you know that these folks have really helped to organize and put it on, and they are listed on the back of your program. But I've got to mention my co-chair, wherever she is, Brenda Silva, who happened to chair the very first, there she is in the back, hello Brenda. She chaired the very first Darwin Day event, and we're on the 12th, so she's still rolling along here. And we have been aided in advance in planning by so many people for refreshments, for ticketing, for advertising, and then there are people who just helped us to set up today, and you're going to help clean up too. I would ask any of those who are helpers to just stand up all at once, and let's have a big round of applause for the workers. So, stand up, workers. Educational co-sponsors, along with an assortment of community and nonprofit organizations to whom we are grateful. We simply could not put on this event without our co-sponsors. So they are some academic departments and also the community organizations. So with that, Liam, I've got to thank you. Take it away. Thank you.
I just have to say, from just my own observations, I wasn't at the very, very first Darwin Day, but I've watched them change over time. They've gotten bigger and more elaborate, and more people show up. This year is the biggest I've ever seen. I understand Minga has been talking with Richard Branson, so I fully expect next year's one will be in space. So, on that note, our main speaker of the main event, of course, is Dr. Michael Shermer. I want to say a few things about him. He's the founder of the Skeptic Society and publisher, as well as editor-in-chief of Skeptic Magazine, which has been around for over 15 years, so I guess he's a founding publisher. He roared into the skeptical field with his legendary book, Why People Believe Weird Things. He has written or edited 15 books, although that number may go up by the time I finish this introduction, as he's working on his iPhone furiously right now, from topics ranging from cycling to economics and evolutionary biology, or Eco-Evo-Bio. Sorry, it's an in-joke for you biologists. I'm proud and honored to have known Michael for 10 years and have worked with him and the staff at Skeptic Magazine for almost as long, and I am very pleased that he's come to our Darwin Day this year, particularly as he's written extensively about Alfred Russel Wallace, you know, the other guy, the co-discoverer of natural selection along with Darwin. So I want to mention again and remind you that after the talk and the Q&A, Michael will be signing books because he's just that gracious. And today on this celebration of Darwin's 200th birthday, he will come and talk to us today about why Darwin matters, so I would love for you to give an appropriate welcome to Dr. Michael Sherman.
Shucks, thanks. Yeah, thanks to Liam. Liam's been working with us. He's one of those people that wrote me in the early years and said, you know, there's a lot of typos in your magazine. I said, well, good, then you can read them every time before we send it out. So I actually now have like half a dozen really top-notch proofreaders that's what you get for complaining. You get put to work, basically. If you two gentlemen could do me a favor and grab these clipboards here. You take one and hand it out. Just hand it down that way. These are the sign-up sheets for eSkeptic. It's the free electronic version of Skeptic Magazine. We publish something every week, an article, an essay, a commentary, a review, a film review, an op-ed piece, whatever, just announcements, and it's free. You can sign on, sign off anytime you like. It's the electronic version of this Skeptic Magazine. Most of you know we investigate claims of the paranormal, pseudoscience, fringe groups, and cults of claims of all kinds between good science, junk science, bad science, voodoo science, pathological science, non-science, and plain old nonsense. And unless you've been on Mars, abducted by aliens, and been on Mars for the last few decades, you know there's a lot of it out there. Nonsense, that is. We're sort of the Ralph Naders of bad ideas, consumer advocates for good ideas. And every issue of Skeptic has a particular theme to it. Like this one is on 9/11. Was 9/11 a conspiracy? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, it was. 19 members of Al-Qaeda plotting to fly planes into buildings by definition constitutes a conspiracy. But of course, that's not what the so-called 9/11 truthers think. They think that 9/11 was an inside job by the Bush administration, who orchestrated it all, Rove and Cheney and everybody behind the scenes. And anyway, that's a different topic. I won't lecture on that today, but you know how we know that the Bush administration did not orchestrate 9/11? Because it worked. So, Rhonda and Minka, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate that. Minka, of course, as you know, created the concept with her partner, Brights, as a cheerier word than atheist, agnostic, non-theist, whatever, non-believers, whatever the words are that we choose to use. And Brian, very funny. I hope we can get you for our Caltech conference next year. That's I know you have so many gigs because there's so many comedians out there doing science. So I think we can get you on that. It really is good stuff. And of course, Theory of Evolution, that was a lot of fun. So maybe there'll be a sing-along later or something like that. I had something kind of funny too happen to me a couple of days ago. I was in Shrewsbury, England for Darwin's birthday. Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, England. And so I was there to see his birthplace. His dad's house is still there. And the grammar school where he went is there, and the Unitarian church where he went to church is still there. It was a Unitarian church. There's a big plaque outside that says it's this ecumenical, diverse church based on all sorts of beliefs. So that was kind of cool. And I had a few hours on my time before I was to give my talk, and so I just went out for a little walkabout. And I had my suit on here, and a really weird thing happened. And this requires just a little bit of background information. I was wearing this coat, and I was wearing this coat. I always wear this coat. It's my Skeptic's uniform. It's black. And at the last CAM, the Amazing meeting, the Amazing Randy's meeting in Las Vegas, and as those of you know, Penn and Teller are a part of this, so all of us every year trek down to see their show. And at the end of the show, they do this amazing double bullet catch, where they fire 357 magnums across the stage, and whatever it is they're doing, we know they're not actually catching bullets fired from a gun in their teeth, but it sure looks like they are. And they have volunteers from the audience come up and sign the bullet and sign the casing so that you can see afterwards that the casing is still in the gun and the bullet has now crossed and it's in the other guy's mouth. Anyway, that's how the trick works. I haven't any idea how they do it other than really well. And anyway, so I got to be a volunteer to go up and sign one of the bullets. So I went up and I signed my bullet, and I put my little initials on the casing and the little happy face on the shell, or vice versa, whatever it was. And then afterwards, I got to keep the bullet, and I put the bullet in my breast pocket. And then, so when I went out for this walkabout the other day, I came out of the hotel in Shrewsbury there, and I heard this noise. This is in a hotel. I heard this noise. I looked up, and there was a crazed evangelist, and he heaved a Gideon's Bible out the window. And it came straight at me, and I ducked, and the Bible hit me right in the chest. And that Bible would have gone right through my heart if it weren't for that bullet. you behind us, non-comedians can make stuff up too. Yes, it's just an exaggerated story. Okay, anyway. Partially stolen from Woody Allen. I'm here to lecture today on Why Darwin Matters. This is my first book, I should note parenthetically, with full frontal nudity on the cover. In America, no less. Now that's pretty cool. I did go, I'll be writing about this next week. Sea Skeptic. I went to the Noah's Ark Zoo Farm outside of Bristol. And it's a guy who's a creationist who runs it's a farm converted to a zoo for kids to come, and it's called the Noah's Ark Zoo. And you go there and you see all the 2x2 animals there. And anyway, he knew who I was, and he wanted to make it really clear that he wasn't one of those loony American creationists that think the earth was created 6,000 years ago. No. Adam and Eve were at least 21,000 years ago. And the earth itself was created about 100,000 years ago. So please do not confuse him with one of those goofball, irrational people from America. No. So I thought I'd talk today a little bit about, I'll do some partial reading from the book and then just tell some stories about Darwin and talk about the theory a little bit. So I opened the book with the prologue of a little story when I went to the Galapagos with my friend Frank Sulloway, who's a Darwin scholar and an evolutionary biologist. So I'll start there. In June 2004, the science historian Frank Sulloway and I began a month-long expedition to retrace Charles Darwin's footsteps in the Galapagos Islands. It turned out to be one of the most physically grueling experiences of my life, and as I have raced a bicycle across America, that is saying something special about what the young British naturalist was able to accomplish in 1835. Charles Darwin was not only one sagacious scientist, he was also one tenacious explorer. I fully appreciated Darwin's doggedness when we hit the stark and barren lava fields on the island of San Cristobal, the first place Darwin explored in the archipelago. With a sweltering equatorial sun and almost no fresh water, it's not long before water-loaded 70-pound packs begin to buckle your knees and strain your back. Add hours of daily bushwhacking through dense, scratchy vegetation, and the romance of field work quickly fades. At the end of one 3-day excursion, my water supply was so dangerously low that Frank and I collected the dew that had accumulated on the tents the night before. One day I sliced my shin on a chunk of lava. Another day I was stung by a wasp and one side of my face nearly doubled in size. At the end of one particularly grueling climb through a moonscape-like area Darwin called the Craterized District, we collapsed in utter exhaustion, muscles quivering and sweat pouring off our hands and faces, after which we read from Darwin's diary, in which the naturalist described a similar excursion as a long walk. Of course, he was 25 and I was 50, so I cut myself a little slack. Death permeates these islands. Animal carcasses are scattered everywhere. The vegetation is coarse and scrappy. Dried and shriveled cactus trunks dot the bleak landscape. The lava terrain is so broken with razor-sharp edges that progress across it is glacially slow. Many people have died there, from stranded sailors of centuries past to wanderlust-driven tourists in recent years. Within days, I had a deep sense of isolation and fragility. Without the protective blanket of civilization, none of us are far from death. Of course, we had a satellite phone, just in case. With precious little water and even less edible foliage, organisms eke out a precarious living, their adaptations to this harsh environment selected over millions of years. A lifelong observer of and participant in the evolution-creation controversy, I was struck by how clear it is in these islands. Creation by intelligent design is absurd. So how then did Darwin depart the Galapagos a creationist? So it's an interesting story. When did Darwin become an evolutionist? The theory of evolution has been around for a while. There was no mechanism for it. And therefore scientists generally are reluctant to accept a new theory until there's some mechanism for it. Lots of people had speculated about, it looks like the continents may have once been together. It kind of looks like pieces of a puzzle, but scientists until the 1960s said, but what could possibly drive a continent to move? So there has to be some other explanation until there was finally a mechanism. So without a mechanism, the theory of evolution was just speculative, and creationism, that is, whatever the creator was, the fixed essentialism of an organism stays that way. It's non-changeable. That is what everybody believed, from Aristotle all the way up. A dog is, it's got fur and a curly little tail and floppy ears and it barks, and it's not going to become a cat. And variations on the theme are just that. They're just varieties. And any kind of pre-Darwinian selections you find in naturalist writings are typically really talking about nature selecting against those varieties that are too far away from the created kind, the essence. So you can still describe a population of an organism in a bell-shaped curve, but it's in that, between the two standard deviations, that's where the essence is. And all the little varieties out here, they usually die. They don't make it. And the reason for that is because they have to stay the same. They are what they are by definition, and they can't change. Ultimately, that's what everybody believed. And it was not until Darwin figured out how to turn that upside down and say, no, that selective process that we've all talked about actually works to create new kinds. That's the essence of the theory. But he didn't figure that out on the Galapagos. He didn't figure that out on the 5-year voyage Beagle. He didn't figure it out on the way home. I don't think he figured it out till he was already home. One reason I realized when I was there with Frank is that, the sun comes up at 6 a.m., it's right on the equator, and the sun goes down at 6 a.m., and it's hotter than hell, and it's dry, and it's hard work, and by the time you're done, the sun goes down, you eat, and you just go to sleep. There's no time for, speculative thinking of science and religion and theory and all this stuff. You just are pooped. So I think he didn't figure it out because he really hadn't the time or energy to think about it until he got home. Now, there are some people who speculate about what he meant by this passage or that passage. One of them, for example, I'll read you. This was 9 months after departing the Galapagos in his ornithological catalog about his mockingbird collection. When I see these islands inside of each other and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds, but slightly differing in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect they are only varieties. So, at least one scientist, a fairly prominent one, has said, see, he's suspicious. No, suspect means I think that. I suspect that these are only varieties. See, he's still saying these are just varieties. They're not becoming a new kind. It isn't until he gets home that he takes his specimens to the famous ornithologist John Gould and says, what are these? I think they're this. And he says, no, actually, they're not that. They're this. And I hope you collected which island you got them from, because that would be really interesting to know. And he said, well, no, I didn't. You see, if you were an evolutionist, and you'd already come up with the idea of adaptive radiation, and the idea that a species lands on an island, and then it radiates out to the other islands and becomes different, then you want to know which island each of your specimens came from. He didn't record those. In fact, he even recorded in his notebook that the local governor, the British governor of the islands, had commented to him that he could tell by the carapace of the tortoises, the shells, which island they came from. He could just look at one and go, oh, that's from whatever island. And Darwin wrote that down as just sort of an interesting tidbit, and they collected lots of tortoises on the Beagle and took them back with them, not as collections, but as fresh meat on the hoof, and they ate them. So Darwin ate his data and threw the shells overboard. That's how we know he was still a creationist. Until he got home. Then he started to piece it all together into the late 30s. He opened notebooks. 1842 he wrote an essay. 1844 he wrote another long letter to a colleague, basically outlining his ideas. It was like 224 pages long. This is a long letter. They wrote long letters back then. And that's how he sort of pieced it together. He didn't publish for several reasons for a long time. People always ask, how come it took him 20 years to publish after he figured it out? Well, because he was still relatively young and unknown, not completely unknown, but not well established in scientific circles to write a big theory of everything book. Scientists mostly frown upon people that write big theories of everything until they've paid their dues and shown that they're actually really working scientists, and maybe toward the end of your career you write the big book, something like that. And in fact, there was an anonymously published book called The Vestiges of Creation, turned out to be by a guy named Robert Chambers, but this was yet another one of these speculative evolution books that had no mechanism for what would cause species to change. And so this book was panned by the scientific critics, and Darwin thought, and his mentors told him, don't do that, because that would be embarrassing for your career. Your career will stall. So instead he wrote a 3-volume monograph on barnacles. And very detailed, specific work, basically paying his dues. And he would have gone on doing that for probably another decade had he not gotten this letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, who Liam kindly mentioned that I wrote my dissertation on. I really would have loved to write something on Darwin, but it is such a saturated market in the business, so to speak. There's such an industry of Darwinian that there isn't as much new ground to plow there. So I did something on Wallace, who had already independently figured it out himself, much later than Darwin, but on his own, and wrote it all down in this essay with a cover letter. Sent it to the only guy I knew that would be interested in it, Darwin, who got this letter well, apparently June of 1858. Wallace sent it. He wrote it in February and sent it on the next ship, which was March 2nd, by boat, so FedEx. So it takes a while to get there. So there is a little bit of a cottage industry of conspiracy theorists that Darwin plagiarized or basically stole Wallace's ideas, but there is not a shred of evidence for this. In fact, all the ideas he supposedly stole were in these 1842 and 1844 letters/essays that he had written. And obviously he was in no hurry until he got this letter. And there was nothing new, really, after he got Wallace's letter that was added on to the stuff he'd already written. And in fact, when they published the joint papers in the July 1st, 1858 Linnaean Society meeting, the proceedings of that, it was just the old stuff. Darwin just put in the 1842 and 1844 papers and a letter to Asa Gray basically establishing his priorities, so there was no conspiracy afoot there. And when Wallace heard about it, months later, he was thrilled that he got to be side by side with his hero, his mentor, Charles Darwin, who is 13 years older than him. So that it all worked out very, very fine that way. And I'll come back to Darwin on the matter of religion later. But I want to talk about the theory that his theory was overthrowing. I mentioned this idea of fixed essences of an organism. And the only going theory at the time, the best one at the time, was William Paley's 1804 book called Natural Theology. There was at the time this kind of, the two books in competition, the Book of Nature and the book, the Bible. And there was a movement to kind of marry the two, called natural theology. That is, God is a very, as most of you here have noticed, very ephemeral, difficult to grasp, maybe doesn't even exist. The difference between a non-existent God and an invisible God is non-existent. So what is it we're actually studying when we're trying to study God? Well, you study the works of God, the results of his actions. That's the idea. So nature, by going out into nature, you're looking at God's creations and the handiwork of the deity, and that's how we know something about God. So William Paley's 1804 book opens in this famous passage that most of you know. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitch my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it lain there forever. But suppose I found a watch on the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. The inference, we think, is inevitable that the watch must have had a maker, that there had to have existed at some time in some place or other an artificer, or artificers, plural, interesting, at some time and in some place or other, who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. This is the real first intelligent design theory. The recent version is just a clever retitling of creationism, which got a bad rap for lost court cases in the 1980s and 90s. And so Paley therefore concludes there cannot be design without a designer, contrivance without a contriver. The marks of design are too strong to be got over. Design must have a designer. The designer must have been a person. That person is God. Well, it takes him a long way to get to there. He concludes sort of inferences of what the characteristics of a designer must be like. Must have agency and intention and intelligence and almost like an architect, something like that, right? So that's the theory that everybody accepted, including Darwin, until he figured out a mechanism. What was the mechanism? Well, Ernst Mayr summarized the theory of evolution in 5 parts. So, everybody already here accepts it, so I don't have to go over how we know it's true. All right, that's good. But basically, there was 5 theories in the origin of species. 1, evolution, that organisms change through time. 2, descent with modification, that evolution proceeds through branching common descent. Offspring are similar to, but slightly different than their parents, plus mutations, you get variation on which natural selection operates. 3, gradualism. This was yet another heretical idea at the time, that change happens slowly over long, gradual periods of time, instead of catastrophism, where there's these major dramatic changes. Multiplication of species. There's not just an evolution of species. There's not just new species. There's more new species. There's sort of a multiplication of species. And then 5, of course, the mechanism that drives in natural selection. Populations tend to increase geometrically. There's not enough, eventually, there's not enough carrying capacity of the environment to support them all. Therefore, some die out. Whatever characteristics that help you survive is what gets passed on. So the problem with the natural selection is a metaphor. It's a little bit like Adam Smith's invisible hand metaphor. There is no invisible hand. There's nobody running the economy, as you may have noticed. By the way, I'll note parenthetically, here's what's going to happen. These bubbles inevitably burst. They do. And in about 2 years, things will turn around and be much better, and whoever's in charge, in this case it'll be Obama, will get the credit for it. That's just the way it goes, but that's a different story. Anyway, there are interesting parallels between the invisible hand and natural selection. In Darwin's case, he opens the origin of species with a long chapter about artificial selection, breeders, who are intentionally selecting certain characteristics. In this case, he spent a lot of time on pigeons. If you want pigeons with feet feathers, you just breed the 2, male and female, that have like the closest thing to feet feathers, and the next generation has slightly more feet feathers. And you just keep, just like dog and horse breeders do, you just do that. The problem with that metaphor is it sounds like there's a selector, doesn't it? And of course, that's what the intelligent design theorists will say. Yeah, you see, Darwin was identifying that there is a selector. That's the problem with the metaphor of natural selection. Right off the bat, it sounds like somebody's doing some selecting. And that isn't at all what he meant. So there's a problem with using metaphor in science, particularly for something you can't see, like an invisible hand. It's really not quite right. And it makes you think that also the species are moving along in some direction. Like when my daughter was young, I was trying to explain evolution to her, and to use an example, polar bears as nice examples of a transitional species between land mammals and marine mammals. And they really have some amazing adaptive features. Thick body fat, thick fur, kind of webbing between their toes on their paws, and they can swim for 50 to 100 miles at a stretch. They can hold their breath for long periods of time and go underwater, and they really are like halfway between marine mammals and land mammals. But it kind of implies that the polar bears are trying to become marine mammals. Like, yes, we can do it. We can really do it. We're sitting here on our little ice pad, and I can just dive in there if I try real hard. And of course, they're not becoming anything except maybe extinct, apparently, with the global warming. Or maybe they'll become brown bears. They'll turn brown and they'll move south, and their bodies will get smaller. Or maybe they'll go extinct. But they're not moving in any direction. There's no prescience to evolution. There's no directionality to it. That's why I like to say, if we ever do encounter aliens, they're not going to be bipedal primates with gnarly stuff on their forehead speaking English with an Indian accent. The chances of all those evolutionary steps from bacteria to big brains and a bipedal primate that happened only once on our planet, maybe several times, but we wiped out the other ones. And the chances of all that happening on some other planet are pretty slim, right? So that's what sort of makes it unique, but there's no directionality to it. Now, some people would challenge me on that. By the way, Dawkins is one, for example, saying that certain things are inevitable. Eyes, some kind of mechanism for moving and seeing and hearing will evolve. Yeah, okay, but maybe there'll be eyes on your fingertips rather than here, or who knows. Some mechanisms may evolve, but not exactly like ours. But that's a different debate. Okay, so moving along then. So that's the theory of. Also the other aspect that's a little misleading is the business of what you call it. If not natural selection, which is a little misleading, how about survival of the fittest? Well, Herbert Spencer coined that phrase, and Darwin liked it and started using it, unfortunately, because it also implies fit like strong, fast, biggest, baddest, nastiest beastie will survive. And that isn't at all what Darwin meant, and it isn't true. I mean, if big brains were so great, how come hardly anybody has them? I don't mean people. There are some that don't have them. But why do most organisms have puny little brains? They're just nothing. Or being slow and camouflaged and and sort of just tiny. Maybe that's the best way to survive. It doesn't matter what it is. It's only whatever it takes to pass along your genes into the next generation. So survival of the fittest, natural selection, it's all a little misleading, and this is one of the reasons people have a hard time accepting evolution, simply because they don't understand it, and there's certain aspects that are misleading. So I'll go over a couple other reasons people resist evolution, and then look at the specific claims of intelligent design. So one reason I think people are resistant to is the idea that you have to choose between science and religion. Of course, since the new atheists have come along, there is a pretty strong movement afoot that sort of implies that if you accept Darwinism, you have to be an atheist. And so there's this kind of culture war, new culture wars going on that about whether that's true or not. I don't happen to think it's true, but we'll come to that in a minute. But a lot of people think it is, and therefore, if you ask somebody, you have to choose between Darwin and your religion. Most people that's a no-brainer for most people, especially Americans. They're not going to choose Darwin. Why would they? So if you make them give something up that's so important to their lives, it has nothing to do with science. We have to remember that there's two aspects of religion. There's the explanatory mode where it's attempting to explain nature. Science beat that part of religion out centuries ago. That's gone. But there's a whole other aspect of religion, obviously it hasn't died out, that fills some kind of human purpose. And that has to do with the social aspects, the music, the food, the camaraderie, the group cohesiveness, the friendship, the social capital, as sociologists call it, that sort of how we all hang together. And religion does a lot of that science just simply doesn't do. I mean, just look at Katrina in New Orleans and compare who did the most, the secular government or the private religion. Well, compare FEMA to the religions that did it, and that pretty much makes the case. I mean, science doesn't do that, governments don't do it very well, religions do it much better. So if you're saying, okay, you have to choose between the theory of evolution and church is going to help the poor, well, what kind of a choice is that? See, that's part of why I think it's the whole false alternative. Most of religion has nothing to do with science, so asking to choose between them is a little ridiculous. Yes, explaining things, that's what science does best. But that is one of the things that people feel like you're making them choose. A couple other things. I think the thing that bothers people about religion is it's a little degrading if you don't interpret it in a positive light. That is, you mean we're one of those guys? One of those chimp ape types? You see the bonobos? I mean, they have sex all the time. Yeah, that's a bad thing. And this guy I met, I have to tell you this funny story. I have a picture of this guy that'll be in my next week's He's Got the Thing. But anyway, his name was Anthony Bush, and he ran this Noah's Ark Zoo. So he had this big poster of the differences between apes and humans. Rather than the gazillion similarities that are remarkable, he wanted to point out the 18 differences. A bunch of which had to do with sex. He seemed very interested in talking about sex for some reason. And he did this whole thing about, how the vagina is structured in such a way that the penis fits just right so humans can have orgasms and no other species has orgasms. I said, really? He goes, that's the only way to have orgasms. I said, oh, no, it's not actually. But listen, that was pretty funny. He thinks the missionary position is the only... Oh, sorry, I left that part out, yeah. I said, speak for yourself, sir. Anyway, and so I showed him a picture that Franz de Waal sent me of bonobos in the missionary position. And I said, whoa, okay. But there is that sense that, we're not one of those guys, are we? I mean, they're animals. Well, yeah. But instead of trying to look at the differences, why don't we look at the similarities? Why don't we look at what we're able to do with our brain or whatever? But it's just the spin you put on it. I think there's also the sense of ethical nihilism, that if this is all true, then what's the basis of morality? If there's no Archimedean point outside of our own world here to tell us what's right and wrong, then you mean anything goes. So you end up with this, again, this choice that is a false alternative. You mean the choice between ethical nihilism and anything goes, and Hitler got away with it, and that's just fine, versus good Christian upstanding, right and wrong, and we know what it is. But that's sort of the choice people feel like they have to make, and that's the wrong choice. Actually, I think Darwinism gives us a moral purpose and so on. And then finally, I should note, because I'm not completely liberal, I'm also partially conservative, is I think there's this idea that evolution only operates below the neck. For most people who accept evolution, they still have a hard time accepting that our brains evolved. Not just our brains, our minds evolved. Our characteristics evolve, our personality evolves, our intelligence evolves. The reason for that is since World War II, it's been largely unacceptable to look at those things that might show group differences and therefore allow for discrimination. Okay, I understand that. I understand why we should be super careful about that and not allow it to be a scientific theory to be abused. This is why Ben Stein was on about the whole expelled thing, from Darwin to Hitler and all that. There is actually a train of thought but everybody used Darwin to their abused Darwin. The capitalists did that, the communists did it, the socialists did it, the fascists did it, everybody did it. The misuse of the theory says nothing about its validity. Okay, I'm going to just mention the three best arguments that the intelligent design creationists put forward. Although I should point out that all of them are in the category of the God of the gaps argument. And it goes like this. I can't think of how X came about naturally, therefore X came about supernaturally. That's it. Just fill in the blank. X is whatever it is. In Paley's time, it was like the wing or the eye, fingers, the various sort of gross anatomy of the human body. In Darwin's time, it was the wing. A guy named St. George Beevart wrote a book basically presenting the problem called the problem of incipient stages. How do you get from no wing to 100% of a wing? I'll grant you it's an adaptive structure once it's fully up and running, and it makes an organism aerodynamic and can fly, escape predators, capture prey, cover a lot of ground in no time. But what good is 50% of a wing? You can't fly with 50% of a wing, so how would a ratcheting, stepwise Darwinian system get you there? So Darwin already answered this, and so I don't know why these creationists keep making the same, well, I do know why, because they have another agenda. And the answer is, it wasn't a poorly developed wing when it was 50%, it was a well-developed something else. In the case of the wing, it appears to be a thermal-regulating device, and possibly a device for moving along the ground or climbing up hills or trees just by grasping, pulling, clawing. In the case of penguins, it's a terrific structure for moving through the water as a rudder. Wings can serve all sorts of purposes. So Darwin's answer, and it's still the answer today, is that it was used for something else and then was accepted. What Steve Gould calls it exaptation, adaptation, exaptation. It was originally evolved for one purpose, then it gets co-opted or accepted later from some other new purpose. Okay. So that's a fairly simple one, but that's the kind of thing like, if you hook your faith to the gap, if you guys can't explain where that came from, boy, that's it. I'm in there, my guy wins. Well, no, then what are you going to do when the gap is filled? And that's what happens. I think somebody mentioned earlier, Newton in the Principia at the end, he wrote about the problem of the plane, while all the planets are in the plane of the ecliptic and they all go around the same, well, in his time, they're all going the same direction, spinning the same way. And how is it that gravity could explain this? He couldn't think of how to figure that out, so he attributed to the deity this most grand, beautiful system laid out by the great intelligence, so forth. And nobody quotes that today. I'm always amazed that intelligent design creationists don't quote that. The great Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist of all time, in one of the most important books ever written, says, an intelligent designer did it. And the reason is because we now have a good theory of how planets are formed, stars and planets are formed out of condensing clouds of interstellar gas, and so forth, and as it collapses, it begins to flatten into a disk and spin and so forth. And so the gap's filled. That's the end of that. Now let's move on to the next thing. And that's the problem with all of these intelligent design arguments. They're just looking for the gap, and it ends there. That's the end of the argument. They want to just stop there. Whereas if you're a graduate student and you want to get your PhD, you have to start at the gap and then try to fill it, or at least enough to convince your professor to sign off on the, on the dissertation. And pass the test, and off you go and create your own lab. I mean, we're in the business of filling gaps. Creationists are in the business of just finding them and stopping right there. And that's the ultimate problem with all these arguments. Nevertheless, the three best arguments, here they are. The anthropic principle, the universe looks like it's fine-tuned for life. So, for example, they quote Sir Martin Rees's book, Just Six Numbers, like omega is the amount of matter in the universe. If omega was greater than 1, would have collapsed long ago. Too much matter, collapse it back. If it's significantly less than 1, then matter would have been too diffuse, and the galaxies and stars wouldn't have formed. Boom. Epsilon, 0.007, how firmly atomic nuclei bind together such that if it was 0.006 or 0.008, matter could not exist. It's not saying that matter would exist in some other form. It couldn't exist at all. It wouldn't even be atoms. Science and religion. Of course, since the new atheists have come along, there is a pretty strong movement afoot that sort of implies that if you accept Darwinism, you have to be an atheist. And so there's this kind of culture war, new culture wars going on that about whether that's true or not. I don't happen to think it's true, but we'll come to that in a minute. But a lot of people think it is, and therefore, if you ask somebody, you have to choose between Darwin and your religion. Most people that's a no-brainer for most people, especially Americans. They're not going to choose Darwin. Why would they? So if you make them give something up that's so important to their lives, it has nothing to do with science. We have to remember that there's two aspects of religion. There's the explanatory mode where it's attempting to explain nature. Science beat that part of religion out centuries ago. That's gone. But there's a whole other aspect of religion, obviously it hasn't died out, that fills some kind of human purpose. And that has to do with the social aspects, the music, the food, the camaraderie, the group cohesiveness, the friendship, the social capital, as sociologists call it, that's sort of how we all hang together. And religion does a lot of that science just simply doesn't do. I mean, just look at Katrina and New Orleans and compare who did the most, the secular government or the private religion? Well, compare FEMA to the religions that did it, and that pretty much makes the case. I mean, science doesn't do that, governments don't do it very well, religions do it much better. So if you're saying, okay, you have to choose between the theory of evolution and church is going to help the poor, well, what kind of a choice is that? See, that's part of why I think it's the whole false alternative. Most of religion has nothing to do with science, so asking to choose between them is a little ridiculous. Yes, explaining things, that's what science does best. But that is one of the things that people feel like you're making them choose. A couple other things. I think the thing that bothers people about religion is it's a little degrading if you don't interpret it in a positive light. That is, you mean we're one of those guys? One of those chimp ape types? You see the bonobos? I mean, they have sex all the time. Yeah, but that's a bad thing. And this guy, man, I have to tell you this funny story. I have a picture of this guy that'll be in my next week's He's Got the Thing. But anyway, his name was Anthony Bush, and he ran this Noah's Ark Zoo. So he had this big poster of the differences between apes and humans. Rather than the gazillion similarities that are remarkable, he wanted to point out the 18 differences. A bunch of which had to do with sex. He seemed very interested in talking about sex for some reason. And he did this whole thing about, how the vagina is structured in such a way that the penis fits just right so humans can have orgasms and no other species has orgasms. Really? He goes, that's the only way to have orgasms. I said, oh, no, it's not actually. But listen, that was pretty funny. He thinks that's the missionary position is the only. Oh, sorry, I left that part out. Yeah. I said, speak for yourself, sir. Anyway, and so I showed him a picture that Franz de Waal sent me of bonobos in the missionary position. And said, whoa, okay. But there is that sense that, like, we're not one of those guys, are we? I mean, they're animals. Well, yeah. But instead of trying to look at the differences, why don't we look at the similarities? Why don't we look at what we're able to do with our brain or whatever? But it's just the spin you put on it. I think there's also the sense of ethical nihilism, that if this is all true, then what's the basis of morality? If there's no Archimedean point outside of our own world here, to tell us what's right and wrong, then you mean anything goes. So you end up with this, again, this choice that is a false alternative. You mean the choice between ethical nihilism and anything goes, and Hitler got away with it, and that's just fine, versus good Christian upstanding, right and wrong, and we know what it is. But that's sort of the choice people feel like they have to make, and that's the wrong choice. Actually, I think Darwinism gives us a moral purpose and so on. And then finally, I should note, because I'm not completely liberal, I'm also partially conservative, is I think there's this idea that evolution only operates below the neck. For most people who accept evolution, they still have a hard time accepting that our brains evolved. Not just our brains, our minds evolved. Our characteristics evolve, our personality evolves, our intelligence evolves. The reason for that is since World War II, it's been largely unacceptable to look at those things that might show group differences and therefore allow for discrimination. Okay, I understand that. I understand why we should be super careful about that and not allow it to be, a scientific theory to be abused. This is why Ben Stein was on about the whole expelled thing, from Darwin to Hitler and all that. There is actually a train of thought but everybody used Darwin to their abuse Darwin. The capitalists did that, the communists did it, the socialists did it, the fascists did it, everybody did it. The misuse of the theory says nothing about its validity. Okay, I'm going to just mention the three best arguments that the intelligent design creationists put forward. Although I should point out that all of them are in the category of the God of the gaps argument. And it goes like this. I can't think of how X came about naturally, therefore X came about supernaturally. That's it. Just fill in the blank. X is whatever it is. In Paley's time, it was like the wing or the eye, fingers, the various sort of gross anatomy of the human body. In Darwin's time, it was the wing. A guy named St. George Mivart wrote a book basically presenting the problem called the problem of incipient stages. How do you get from no wing to 100% of a wing? I'll grant you it's an adaptive structure once it's fully up and running, and it makes an organism aerodynamic and can fly, escape predators, capture prey, cover a lot of ground in no time. But what good is 50% of a wing? You can't fly with 50% of a wing, so how would a ratcheting, stepwise Darwinian system get you there? So Darwin already answered this, and so I don't know why these creationists keep making the same, well, I do know why, because they're, because they have another agenda. And the answer is, it wasn't a poorly developed wing when it was 50%, it was a well-developed something else. In the case of the wing, it appears to be a thermoregulating device, and possibly a device for moving along the ground or climbing up hills or trees just by grasping, pulling, clawing. In the case of penguins, it's a terrific structure for moving through the water as a rudder. Wings can serve all sorts of purposes. So Darwin's answer, and it's still the answer today, is that it was used for something else and then was accepted. What Steve Gould calls it acceptation. Adaptation, acceptation. It was originally evolved for one purpose, then it gets co-opted or accepted later from some other new purpose. Okay. So that's a fairly simple one, but that's the kind of thing like, if you hook your faith to the gap, if you guys can't explain where that came from, boy, that's it. I'm in there, my guy wins. Well, no, then what are you going to do when the gap is filled? And that's what happens. I think somebody mentioned earlier, Newton in the Principia at the end, he wrote about the problem of the plane, while all the planets are in the plane of the ecliptic, and they all go around the same, well, in his time, they're all going the same direction, spinning the same way. And how is it that gravity could explain this? He couldn't think of how to figure that out, so he attributed to the deity this most grand, beautiful system laid out by the great intelligence, so forth. And nobody quotes that today. I'm always amazed that intelligent design creationists don't quote that. The great Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist of all time, in one of the most important books ever written, says, intelligent designer did it. And the reason is because we now have a good theory of how planets are formed, stars and planets are formed out of condensing clouds of interstellar gas, and so forth, and as it collapses, it begins to flatten into a disk and spin and so forth. And so the gap's filled. That's the end of that. Now let's move on to the next thing. And that's the problem with all of these intelligent design arguments. They're just looking for the gap, and it ends there. That's the end of the argument. They want to just stop there. Whereas if you're a graduate student and you want to get your PhD, you have to start at the gap. and then try to fill it, or at least enough to convince your professor to sign off on the, on the dissertation, and pass the test, and off you go and create your own lab. I mean, we're in the business of filling gaps. Creationists are in the business of just finding them and stopping right there. And that's the ultimate problem with all these arguments. Nevertheless, the three best arguments, here they are. The anthropic principle, the universe looks like it's fine-tuned for life. So, for example, they quote Sir Martin Rees's book, Just Six Numbers, like omega is the amount of matter in the universe. If omega was greater than 1, would have collapsed long ago. Too much matter collapsed it back. If it's significantly less than 1, then matter would have been too diffuse, and the galaxies and stars wouldn't have formed. Boom. Epsilon, 0.007, how firmly atomic nuclei bind together such that if it was 0.006 or 0.008, matter could not exist. It's not saying that matter would exist in some other form. It couldn't exist at all. There wouldn't even be atoms. 3 dimensions, can't be 2 or 4 unless you live in flatland, and we don't. N equals 10 to the 36, the ratio of the strength of the electromagnetism to gravity, such that if it was just a few less zeros, the universe would be too young or too small for life to evolve. The relationship between electromagnetism and gravity. The fabric of the universe, if there was too much featurelessness, if it was too even or too diverse, too asymmetrical, then stars couldn't have formed, therefore no planets, no life. And then finally, the cosmological constant, which sort of holds the universe together. Anyway, you get the idea. There's all kinds of numbers. It looks like it's fine-tuned. Okay. So what's the answer to this? Well, there's a little bit of what Carl Sagan called carbon chauvinism in the argument. Like, we think we understand chemistry and biochemistry, and this is the way life happened here, so we're pretty sure it couldn't happen under some other form of physics or chemistry somewhere else. And I think we're a little anthropocentric and egotistic and probably too ignorant to think of how physics could exist in some other structure. Maybe there are other universes in which something like matter could form and therefore life. It's a little, also, I find a little disturbing to say that, you know, life, the universe is fine-tuned for life. I mean, this is, nobody cares about stars or planets, it's us. Well, no, actually it isn't. There's hardly anywhere you can live. It's mostly empty space, and most of the matter in stars and quasars and supermassive black holes and all that, you can't live on those places. And most of the planets appear to be largely uninhabitable. So the idea that this is all here just for life, well, actually, no. I mean, in a way, you can say that makes their argument, right? What a miraculous creation it is here. Well, okay, we'll see about that. And then finally, I think, well, two finallys. There may be some underlying principle. This is Steve Weinberg's idea that, you know, we're so ignorant in physics still, even after 400 years. We still don't have a theory of everything to tie quantum physics with global general relativity. There may be some underlying principle, you know, the equation is supposed to fit on the back of the t-shirt, maybe it has to wrap around a couple times. But in any case, something that kind of unifies physics still hasn't been done. And Weinberg says, you know, it could be that all these little numbers everybody's so up in arms about may all just fall into place, and there's just one number. There may just be one mysterious number. And that needs an explanation. But that's far different than saying there's 10 or 20 or whatever. And then I like the multiverse idea, that there might be multiple universes, all with different configurations of laws of nature. I like this because it's Darwinian. And the argument goes like this. This is Lee Smollen's theory, and the Living Cosmos, I think is the name of this book, that any universe with laws of nature like ours gives rise to matter, atoms and molecules and stars and planets and so forth. And when stars, if they're big enough and they collapse into a black hole, and at the center of the black hole is a singularity, which is at least one theory of the origin of our universe, came out of a singularity. So it could be that when black holes collapse, they collapse into a singularity and create another black hole. Create another universe, a bubble universe that has laws similar to the laws that it had. So it's like giving birth. And the laws of nature are like its DNA that it passes along. And bubble universes that have different laws of nature that don't give rise to matter, don't have stars, that can't collapse into black holes, and therefore they go extinct. See, it's a nice Darwinian explanation. I like it. There's no evidence for it at all. However, the other side has no evidence either. So don't be taken back when they say, you don't have any evidence. Well, when did evidence matter for your side? A second point, the design inference. This is Bill Dembski's big thing, that if you go to Mount Rushmore, nobody looks at those big heads of the presidents and go, wow, that's incredible that erosion and wind and rain carved those. And yet we all look at the face on Mars, because it's sort of a grainy photograph shot by the Voyager spacecraft, and we laugh that the ufologists think, Martians built that to signal us, and therefore we should go to Mars and talk to them, or something like that. We all know that nature makes these patterns. I call it patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in random noise. We all know that happens. So the question is, what's the difference between Mount Rushmore and the face on Mars? And their answer, Dembski's answer, is an intelligence was behind the face on Mars. Chance was behind the... intelligence was behind... It's a little hot up here. Oh, it's all right. Who's that governor of New Orleans? So, all right, so this is Dembski's argument. I mean, it's reasonable, right? This is what the SETI program is trying to do. What's the algorithm to detect, say, the difference between a rotating neutron star that sends these blips out and an intelligent alien who would send out maybe the blips of prime numbers? Well, that would be it, right? That would be the difference. If no neutron star is going to rotate and give us prime numbers. It just doesn't do that. So that would be a difference. Okay, that seems like a reasonable argument. Until you push them and say, well, what is it that would... What's the algorithm? What's the difference between, say, random molecules bumping around and self-replicating DNA? I mean, how do you know if one is created and, say, the other one isn't? How do you know? So they have no answer to this. What would be the way to do that? And also the problem is that, like, say, archaeologists might say, I can tell the difference between, I don't know, a hearth that's made out of bricks and just a random pile of rocks that fell off the side. Yeah, okay, because we have experience of people making things. But how can you tell the difference? It's a little grayer. If, say, the difference between an Australopithecine hand axe and a rock that just tumbled down the hill that's kind of chipped on both sides. There has to be something of a symmetry to it. An archaeologist who's experienced looking at these things could, yes, infer that there was an intentional chipping because it has sort of a scalloped and consistent symmetry to the way it was chipped versus the randomness of the stone that just rolls. There has to be some way to tell the difference. And the intelligent design guys have yet to give us the formula for whatever it is. The eye, the bacterial flagellum, blood clotting mechanism, whatever their favorite X is that they feel we haven't explained yet. And then finally, the explanatory filter, the idea that kind of inferred from this that, well, this is really kind of the same thing, really. It's just, how do you explain complex adaptive systems that rise from simple to complex? And again, they're just looking for some kind of difference between chance and directionality. And of course, all scientists are looking for that. But until you actually have some kind of testable way to do it, you give us the mechanism that you think is working and then we'll test it. Then they're still not doing science. So when I push them, for example, and say, okay, let's say we allow intelligent design to be taught in public schools, science classes, what are you going to teach? And this is really gets them, rather than debating them about whether it should be taught or not. I just say, okay, go ahead. It's an 11th grade biology class, or whatever, 10th grade, I guess, when they do the biology with genetics. So what are you going to teach in the genetics section? Well, we would say, something like DNA could not have come from RNA, and RNA could not have come from the pre-RNA world that you guys think, and so on. And yeah, like, okay, that took like 30 seconds. Now what are you going to teach? You have 2 weeks. Well, we teach genetics. Right. So. The real agenda. So here's what's really going on with these guys. This is the epigraph of this chapter. Johnson calls his movement the wedge. The objective, he said, is to convince people that Darwinism is inherently atheistic, thus shifting the debate from creationism versus evolution to the existence of God versus the non-existence of God. From there, people are introduced to the truth of the Bible and then the question of sin, and finally introduced to Jesus. So I know Dembski and these guys pretty well. And Dembski, for example, says scientific creationism has prior religious commitments, whereas intelligent design does not. This was in a publication in which he's basically saying, we're not like those old crazy creationists. This is like my guy in England. Don't confuse me with those idiot American creationists. But he's a little bit like that. Don't confuse us with Dwayne Gish and the younger creationists. No, this is science. Well, baloney. On February 6, 2000, Dembski told the National Religious Broadcasters at their annual conference in Anaheim, California, that, quote, intelligent design opens the whole possibility of us being created in the image of a benevolent God. The job of apologetics is to clear the ground. Do you know, Christian apologetics, they're not apologizing. It's an explanation for why we believe what we believe. They're arguments, basically. The job of apologetics is to clear the ground, to clear obstacles that prevent people from coming to the knowledge of Christ. And if there's anything that I think has blocked the growth of Christ is the free reign of the Spirit and people accepting the Scripture in Jesus Christ, it is the Darwinian naturalistic view. So make no mistake about it, creationists and their intelligent design brethren do not just want equal time. They want all the time that they can get. Listen to the words of Philip Johnson, who I quoted at the epigram there. University of California, Berkeley law professor, and the fountainhead of the intelligent design movement. Christians in the 20th century have been playing defense. They've been fighting a defensive war to defend what they have, to defend as much of it as they can. I always like this when they always like we're in this minority. 90% of Americans are on your side. We're in this beleaguered poor. I mean, Obama throws us a bone. Non-believers, yay, finally. And they're up in arms about this. Oh, America's going to secular nation. It is a secular nation. It's supposed to be. He continues, it never turns the tide. What we're trying to do is something entirely different. We're trying to go into the enemy territory, their very center, and blow up the ammunition dump. What is their ammunition dump in this metaphor? It is their version of creation. And then later he says, this isn't really and never has been a debate about science. It's about religion and philosophy. The argument goes like this. If you accept Darwinian evolution, that means we're just animals. If we're just animals, then that means there was no creator. If there's no creator, there's no God. If there's no God, then anything goes, and America's going to go to hell in a handbasket. That's basically, if you teach our kids this stuff, then they're going to be doing it like they do it on the Discovery Channel. There's some song that they like to quote from. Is this true? Well, no. So I want to make two final points. I think the deeper agenda of looking for an intelligent designer, God, let's be honest, just call him id or it, whatever, is I don't know what you could possibly find using the tools of science. Let's say that Dembski's turns out to be right. DNA was designed by an intelligent designer and planted here on Earth, whatever, maybe on the moon. There is this theory, this pangenesis, that life is seeded here, on comets or meteorites, which you can find amino acids and other sort of crude protein chains and things like this. Maybe it was seeded here by either by accident or maybe some intelligence. Let's say it's aliens from planet Vega, because I'm pretty sure I saw that in a Star Trek episode. Vega is featured a lot. Let's say the Vegans is 26 light years away. Let's say the Vegans came here and they planted, the self-replicating molecule in the early season, got the ball rolling. Let's say that happened. And we found out about this because we found a pod out in Blythe, which is almost as good as the moon. And they have the blueprints in there explaining how they did it. Wow, this would be incredible. NASA would be thrilled to get more funding to go to Vega and all this stuff, find out what those guys are like. But it wouldn't answer the question of where life originated, would it? It doesn't tell us how life evolved. It just said the Vegans did it. Well, that's interesting, but where did those guys come from? How did they get there? Did they evolve on Vega? Or, oh no, it turns out we finally get to Vega in a couple centuries, and lo and behold, they were seeded there from some alien civilization on the other side of the galaxy who was planted there from some aliens in Andromeda, and so on and so forth, and you get where I'm going with the argument. At some point, there has to be some bottom-up natural evolutionary process. As soon as you posit that there's an external creator who set it into place, where did that guy come from? And ultimately, that's the best science will ever be able to do, even if you take it all the way back and say, well, it was a designer outside of our bubble universe that triggers the collapse of black holes to create universes or something. Okay, but where did that designer come from? That would still be a reasonable argument. So I contend that if we ever did, if SETI's ever successful, again, they're not going to be like us, bipedal primates with an early stuff before the English Indian accent. They're not going to be like that. They'll be so far ahead of us. Think about what it would be like if we discovered an alien. It won't be behind us because we just finally accomplished spaceflight technology and then abandoned it. Humans, anyway. Sort of like how the Japanese went back on the gun or whatever. Anyway, so civilizations do sometimes go backwards, but let's say we eventually find them. They'll be far ahead of us. Never like the ufology people think, you know, the aliens landed at Roswell in 1947 and gave us transistors. Wow, just slightly better than vacuum tubes. You know, they're just like 5 years ahead of us. We back-engineered their advanced technology and created the transistor radio. Because it would imply that the evolutionary parallels would have to be just exactly the same on that other planet and our planet. The chances of that happening are virtually zero. They would be either way behind us or way ahead of us. They won't be way behind us because we won't find them. So they'll be way ahead of us. Take any of those curves like Moore's Law, the doubling power of computer chips for every $100, $1,000 on a computer, it doubles every 12 to 18 months. Just take any of those curves of technological progress from the Wright brothers to the moon in 66 years, any of those kinds of rapid curves, and an alien civilization that we would encounter would probably be maybe 50,000 years ahead of us, 500,000, 5 million, probably in the hundreds of thousands to millions of years ahead of us, who would have then taken those Moore law type curves and applied them for that long of time. We're already pretty close to being able to create life forms in the test tube. I mean, J. Craig Ventnor is probably going to introduce this within the next year or two. You know, stem cells, now that we have a president that likes stem cells, you know, we'll finally make some progress again on that front. You know, the deity can't even create new limbs for Iraqi veterans, and yet we'll be able to do this. Soon, probably within maybe half a century, I think, probably be able to grow new limbs for amputees. And surely an alien that we would encounter would be able to do all of this if we're already pretty close to doing it. But don't stop there. Just think of creating a planet or a solar system and a new star with planets. That's just an engineering problem of just getting clouds of interstellar gas to start collecting and so on. That's just an engineering problem. They might be able to do this. Anyway, what would you encounter? What would you call a being that could create life in a test tube and cells and self-replicating molecules, planets and stars, and maybe even cause planets and stars to collapse into black holes and create new universes? What would you call a being that can create universes in life? Well, if you know the technology, you're always like us, but really smart. If you don't know the technology, well, that's God. In other words, calling it intelligent designer or God or whatever, it doesn't explain anything. It's just a word filler, a gap filler, until we figure out the explanation. So ultimately, it's only science that can do that. And it just carries itself out. And therefore, the intelligent design agenda, as I just read it to you, will ultimately fail. The best they can ever do is to find something that's not God, but like us. And that then will fail for them, and then therefore it's a lost program. So where do we go from there? Okay, I'll read the last two paragraphs and then we'll have a Q&A. I feel like Elliot Spitzer in church. So how can we find spiritual meaning in a scientific worldview? Well, spirituality is a way of being in the world, a sense of one's place in the cosmos, a relationship to that which extends beyond oneself. There are many sources of spirituality. So in fact, I would say science and spirituality are complementary, not conflicting, additive, not detractive. Anything that generates a sense of awe may be a source of spirituality. Science does this in spades. I'm deeply moved, for example, when I observe through my 8-inch reflecting telescope in my backyard in Pasadena, all those city lights, I can still see the fuzzy little patch of light that is the Andromeda galaxy. It's not just because it's lovely, although it is, but because I also understand that the photons of light landing on my retina left Andromeda 2.9 million years ago. when our ancestors were tiny-brained hominids roaming the plains of Africa. And I'm doubly stirred because it was not until 1923 that the astronomer Edwin Hubble, using the 100-inch telescope on Mount Wilson just above my home in the foothills of Pasadena, discovered that this nebula was actually an extragalactic stellar system of immense size and distance. Hubble subsequently discovered that the light from most galaxies is shifted toward the red end of the spectrum, meaning that the universe is expanding away from an explosive creation. It was the first empirical evidence indicating that the universe had a beginning and thus was not eternal. What could be more awe-inspiring, more numinous, magical, spiritual than this cosmic visage? For my money, Mount Wilson Observatory is the Shark Cathedral of our time. We are pattern-seeking, storytelling primates. To most of us, the pattern of life and the universe indicates design. For countless millennia, we have taken these patterns and constructed stories about how life and the cosmos were designed specifically for us from above. For the past few centuries, however, science has presented us with a viable alternative in which the design comes from below, through the direction of built-in, self-organizing principles of emergence and complexity. Perhaps this natural process, like the other natural forces, which we are all comfortable accepting as non-threatening to religion, was God's way of creating life. Maybe God is the laws of nature, or even nature itself, but this is a theological supposition, not a scientific one. What science tells us is that we are but one among hundreds of millions of species that evolved over the course of 3.5 billion years on one tiny planet among many orbiting an ordinary star. Itself one of possibly billions of solar systems in an ordinary galaxy that contains hundreds of billions of stars. Itself located in a cluster of galaxies not so different from millions of other galaxy clusters, themselves whirling away from one another in an expanding cosmic bubble universe that very possibly is only one among a near infinite number of bubble universes. Is it really possible that this entire cosmological multiverse was designed and exists for one tiny subgroup of a single species on one planet in a lone galaxy in that solitary bubble universe? It seems unlikely. Yet herein lies the spiritual side of science. It's sensuality, if you'll pardon an awkward neologism, but one that echoes the sensuality of discovery. If religion and spirituality are supposed to generate awe and humility in the face of the Creator, what could be more awesome and humbling than the deep space discovered by Hubble and the cosmologists and the deep time discovered by Darwin and the evolutionists? Darwin matters because evolution matters. Evolution matters because science matters. And science matters because it is the preeminent story of our age, an epic saga about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. Thank you. Oh, Q&A. You want to have them come? What? Oh, we have a microphone here, and just a microphone over there. Or if you want to just stand up and shout it out, I'll repeat the question. I can do that. Right there.
Thank you, Dr. Sherman. I'm an astronomer and looked at Andromeda with the naked eye outside the town frequently still. I wanted to ask you whether you think there's any merit to the idea that religiosity may have a genetic value for survival in primitive times, and also that scientific skepticism may also have a genetic value for survival.
Yes, good question. Does he can see Andromeda with his naked eye? I'm impressed. I can't see that in LA. Anyway, and is it possible religion has an adaptive purpose to it, or the tendency to be religious or religiosity? And what about skepticism? Might there be an adaptive purpose to that? Well, on the religiosity aspects, no question about it. I think there's pretty good evidence now that one of the things that religion does is unite people into a collective whole. We're very social primates. Probably one of the key characteristics to our survival is just the fact that we're pro-social and cooperative within our groups. although we're very tribal and xenophobic between groups, so we have this constant tension there. So I think, well, I wrote a book about this, The Science of Good and Evil, that basically what happened, most of our morals evolved having to do with social interactions with our other fellow group members. As long as the groups are fairly small, that works pretty well. Informal means of behavior control through families and small group communities, like shunning somebody who is nasty and violates the social norms a lot, things like that. What happens when populations get huge is that those informal means don't work anymore. And so you have to have some way of codifying it into more formal means. So the two organizations that did that around about 5,000 years ago were government and religion. That is, one laid down the rules and says, this is what you have to do if you want to be a member of our tribe. And if you don't, then we're going to punish you now. And then the other one said, yeah, and by the way, you're not getting away with it, even if you think you did, because you'll get punished in the next life. So really, they're both, it's just means of behavior control for a social primate species. So I think religion has always been deeply wrapped up in that. And so therefore, I think the idea of imagine no religion, I wonder if you can, no 9/11, no 7/7. This is, how Dawkins opens his book. I like the idea, but I don't think it's viable. I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon, simply because it has a lot of other roles that have nothing to do with science. And in any case, I don't think 9/11 and 7/7 are religiously driven. I think they're politically driven, and religion is an excuse to tribalize people. It's an excuse to commit crimes and so on. It's an excuse to get people to blow themselves up by promising them 72 virgins or something. But what's behind it, I think, is just good old-fashioned tribalism, land-grabbing, power hunger, and the religion is just an excuse. Without religion, people would just divide each other up in other means.
Hi. Hi, Nikos Leverins, Occidental Class of 95.
Hey.
I'm also an organizer with the Sacramento Freethinkers, Atheists, and Non-Believers Meetup Group.
All right.
I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the imperative of secularists, humanists, or whatever term you would want to describe in standing up and being counted in this civic holiday of ours. And we're here in the capital of the state that has 1 in 8 people in the country. And, look at all of us here. We need to, in my opinion, I think we need to be more kind of assertive as to who we are, what we believe, and how we can best achieve those goals in the political process. Almost 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, we're still talking about loyalty oaths here in California.
Yeah.
Senator Lowenthal's introduced the bill. So what other issue, could you speak to that, and what salient issues do you think the secular humanist community should be kind of rallying around?
Well, one of the things that I liked what Minga did with the Brights was to use the gay movement as a model for how you can trigger social change. And it starts with just standing up and saying, look, you can't say that about us anymore. We're not going to put up with it. Boom. That's it. Just saying it makes a difference, and say it over and over. And if you got to slap them, we'll slap them. Metaphorically. And that's how it works. I mean, there's no magic guy in the sky that's going to do this for us. You have to make it happen. That's what the civil rights movement was about in the 60s, and now the gay movement in the 90s. And so that's what we're doing now. Atheists are sort of the last of the groups where it's been okay to discriminate. Now we have a president that said, no, let's not do that anymore. Let's count them as actual citizens. Hey, there's an idea. And the fact that somebody just said it makes a difference, doesn't it? It makes it, yeah. So that's how you start off by just saying it. And the passion you had just in saying that, that's inspirational. So go out and do that.
Yes, I am a devout Christian, and I believe in the triune God and the love and salvation of Jesus Christ. I also believe that God created this world and that man became man when God breathed into him the breath of life. To me, that's the soul, the breath of life. And so we became separate then from the animal. My question is that I also believe in evolution. And I see the truth in the science behind evolution. But whenever I hear about this, it's always in an adversarial point, that evolution and being a Christian, believing in the triune Almighty God, somehow they're in conflict. But I don't feel that conflict within me. I've never had anybody explain to me how they cannot coexist in one person.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations for your courage to stand up and say that in this room. And hey, we'll give you some cake afterwards, too. So. See, we have good food, and we have music. Well, actually, you're in the majority. Most Christians who know anything about science know that evolution happened. It isn't something you believe in or don't believe in. It just is, and almost everybody thinks that. Even so 2 billion Catholics have been told by the Pope it's okay to accept evolution, right? So there's actually a majority. What you're hearing is the vocal minority in the case of extreme fundamentalists and, say, the intelligent design movement. There really aren't that many intelligent design proponents. It's just that they have a really clever marketing campaign, right? It's a really clever phrase, intelligent design theory. You get it instantly. Oh yeah, intelligent design. And that. So, and admittedly, fundamentalist, atheists, if you want to use that term, there's a lot of people on that side that do feel you have to choose one or the other. I don't. I don't see that they have anything to do with each other. I mean, once you concede, say, souls or some being outside of space and time, it's really, science has nothing to say about that. I see no way you could ever get there from here using science. As I said with my analogy of looking for the aliens, what are you going to find? I don't see how you could get it. At some point you make a leap of faith, and why you did that, that's personal to you, and I think everybody has a different faith journey in that regard. So I don't see how they have to be conflicting. Although then I might, if we were having a fun conversation over adult beverages or something where you can talk about this stuff, wonder where you got that idea of the triune God, and why would you believe that? As opposed to other things that you might reject or accept based on evidence. Say, you accept global warming or you don't. Well, why? Well, I've studied this, or I don't know, I listen to talk radio or whatever. And like, why not treat that like any other belief and then analyze it and so on? And there I probably would be skeptical and maybe push you on a few of those things. I mean, why can't bonobos and chimps have a soul? I mean, they're so nice. And gosh. Connection, I feel like connection, but anyway. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul Story. I'd like to ask you, Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, came up with the idea of a non-overlapping magisterium, where you basically have one domain of science and another domain of religion, and the fact that there was no conflict between them, which kind of gives me a little bit of consternation, because the basis of morality and ethics, in my view, for us to have stewardship of the planet and prevent global warming and ozone depletion and groundwater pollution and overpopulation, science has got to step up and say, we do have a say in ethics and morality. Perhaps a more valid say than the religious and theological traditions. So I was wondering, this whole question is somewhat overlapping to your last answer.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I've essentially been arguing something like Gould's position, although I don't think he carried it out all that far. And I think by the time he made the argument, nobody stood up to challenge it. Phil Dawkins did in the God Delusion, and then Steve was already dead, so hey. I mean, how can we have a debate? Well, it depends on the specific claim. I mean, religion is such a big social entity. What part of religion are you overlapping or not overlapping with science? Again, back to my original comment, that if you're saying, well, religion has something to say about, the physical structure of atoms or something, well, no, actually it doesn't. There's no overlap there at all. It has nothing interesting to say for us, although it used to. But if you're talking about morals, now that's a little bit of gray area. And there, I know Gould accepted the is-ought fallacy, that you cannot deduce the ought from what actually is. And I don't really fully accept that. I think we can say something about what we ought to do based on what we are actually like. So, for example, we appear to be a primate species that practices serial monogamy. with a lot of sort of in-between cheating going on there. And so it's one of these kind of fuzzy gray areas where I think it does help to know what you're actually like. And all that all that testosterone and dopamine and oxytocin does when you're in a position where you would allow that or not to influence your behavioral choices. Am I saying this carefully enough to? In other words, what morality means is doing something that you didn't have to do, or not doing something when you could have. It's making a choice. So I assume we have free will and agency to make those choices, and then you're put in a position where you are going to hurt somebody who's expecting you to behave in a certain way, and it could be any other example, truth-telling in business relationships, something like this. It doesn't matter. And then you make that choice. So there, I think, knowing that, I think it helps to know something about human nature, and that's what science tells us. But then at some point, it's not going to give us that behavioral control or something like that. And I think that's where Gould wants to say, well, religion has something to say about that. Maybe. I will grant religion this. It had a 4,000-year head start on science and secular philosophy. So they actually figured out a lot of things. I mean, if you read a lot of what biblical and other religious traditions say about what you should and shouldn't do, well, most of it actually makes a lot of good sense. A lot of it's kind of goofy now in modern age, but there's still, central principles of truth-telling and fidelity and things like that that are obviously true. Yep. One more.
To hold down the Dawkins end of things a little bit, a thought occurred to me in what you were saying when two things you said. First, you pointed out that religion has an explanatory purpose and a moral purpose. And secondly, you said, well, suppose that it turns out to be true, the intelligent design claim, and we find that life was seeded here by some designer, so what? Right? In other words, the intelligent design theory doesn't answer the design question. Well, it occurred to me that it also doesn't answer the moral question. Because if we were to discover that we have been, it occurs to me that if you make the realization that because I say so is not a sufficient answer, that is the core principle. Once you make that realization, everything else, both morally and in design, falls into place. There's no reason to accept because I say so is a good moral argument. And that sets you on the road toward a naturalistic ethics, just like it set you on the road to a naturalistic science. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
I agree. Actually, I like Brian's theory of because I said so, stand up straight. I've never heard that as the theory of bipedalism. Very nice. We have solved many problems here today. Yes. Well, I guess I would agree with you. I don't see why, but I don't see how that holds up or defends Dawkins against Gould or whatever. I'm not sure it does. I think, honestly, Gould's problem was he was a very strong left-leaning. His politics was very strong left-leaning. He was one of those that had a very difficult time allowing evolution to apply above the neck. And therefore, because of very legitimate reasons of all the abuses of eugenics and so on, I can see why people were so cautious about that. But back in the 70s, when Ed Wilson published Sociobiology, and Gould and Lewontin went after him in the pages of the New York Review of Books, and they started that Orwellian science for the people at Harvard. Well, who else would it be for? I mean, it has that kind of Cuban Marxist, for the people, taxi for the people, science for the people sort of thing. I think Gould never carried the arguments out like you just did right there, simply because of those reasons. And I think here I'll wax political for just a minute. Most scientists are academics. Most academics are liberals. Most liberals are uncomfortable applying evolutionary theory to the mind because it implies that we might have fixed natures that cannot be modified by political change, by political dictate. We're going to redistribute goods. We're going to impose certain rights on people and so on. Those aren't going to work if we're not really, really behaviorally flexible. This is the idea. And so I don't think it has to be that way, but that's what people think. And so I think it's rare for a scientist to actually come out and be more politically right, conservative, I mean. Yeah. And yet, I wrote a whole chapter about this in Why Darwin Matters, and then a whole book about it on the mind of the market, that in fact I think there's a nice link between Adam Smith and Charles Darwin. By the way, I should note parenthetically, this is the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's first book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is actually very Darwinian, before Darwin, because of course we didn't know about this, but he just said, the first sentence in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, howsoever selfish we think humans are, there's this other side of us that is empathetic and sympathetic. We feel other people's pain. Why would that be? Where does that come from, he asks. And then 300 pages later, he's giving you the answer. And it is that we have this dual nature. We're selfish and tribal and all this, but we're pretty cooperative and nice and pro-social at other times. And the whole point of civil society is to structure it in a way to attenuate the one and accentuate the other. And anyway, so I think we can carry that out. I think we're supposed to stop, but we'll just be around. We can continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. We're going to do the drawing now. If my victim drawer is going to come up on stage here. If you haven't got your ticket in, it's too late. That's right. There's also the drawing at the educational table for the science educators, and we're going to be singing Happy Birthday in a second here. So, that's a good question. Bingo. We can take the top off, right? That would help.
McKinney from Roseville. Jeannie.
Janae McKinney. Janae McKinney, is she here? She's here? Yeah, that's the question. You're all convinced she's here, but I don't see anyone stepping forward. Janae McKinney, are you in the room? Please step forward. Thank you. Hey! All right, we have a winner. She is in the room. She's in the house. Okay, for the educational drawing, you can reach in again. Much smaller pile. Odds are much better here. Kind of like the Mexican lottery.
Chet Dixon.
Chet Dixon. Prize is a signed copy of Why Darwin Matters. I also want to mention there's an entire table full that will be signed by the author right over here to my right. Oh, pick another one.
Excuse me.
No, I'm sorry.
Some guys want to see your YouTube video. He wants to told me your
Kasha?
He said I should put mine on. This is your beat me.
Maslowski.
You know?
Kasha?
Kasha Maslowski, are you here? Did we mention there's cake? Later.
I think that's enough. I don't think we need to see the rest of that.
Try one more time.